As a true Dominican, I really think we could make it. But as a people, we have to learn to commit. Journey ahead will never be smooth and sweet. But as an ambitious nation, we have to be upbeat. I know we have done it before, so we can do it again. All depend with God, but pride we have to maintain in order to create a better world. Every living soul has to play their role. We have an opportunity to change things around, an opportunity to change things, an opportunity to make Dominica strong. We have an opportunity to change things around, an opportunity to change things, an opportunity to make Dominica strong. We got to stamp out the devil, stamp them out, stamp out the evil. Jealousy, not by me, certainly. We got to stamp out greediness, stamp them out, stamp out wickedness, stamp them out. Jealousy, not by me, certainly. Tomorrow is the first day. The rest of our lives, let's make tomorrow the first day of the rest of our life. We have an opportunity to change things around, an opportunity to change things, an opportunity to make our country strong. Change. I remember the love and unity that we once shared. Starting from the home, the children would be prepared. Food was a daily part of our living. This society would be part of our children upbringing. We used to eat everything we grow and grow everything we eat. But smiling faces would glow and the people were real discreet. We need to go back to where we were. Otherwise we'll witness things we never seen before. We have an opportunity to change things around, an opportunity to change things, an opportunity to make Dominica strong. We have an opportunity to change things around, an opportunity to change things, an opportunity to make Dominica strong. We got to stamp out the ugly, stamp them out, stamp out cruelty, jealousy, not by we, certainly. We got to fight hypocrisy, or conspiracy, jealousy, not by we, certainly. Tomorrow is the first day. The rest of our lives, let's make tomorrow the first day of the rest of our lives. We have an opportunity to change things around, an opportunity to change things, an opportunity to make our country strong. Oh, change, change. Grandma used to say that laziness is a real crime. It captivates your body, then retards your mind. As a people, we have to change this old attitude and give our country all the love we really should. Instead, we sit and we criticize, where we say let's now analyze and give young people no scope in difficult times just how to cope. It's us to build them the foundation in order to build a stronger, vibrant nation. We have an opportunity to change things around.
Yes, we got an opportunity to change things around. Let me thank always each and every time Miss Joy Stout for borrowing us this song, as it were, that we always normally start our program with right here. Just about 6 o'clock each and every Sunday on that space on social media. Folks, good evening to you. A very special good evening to all of you locked into that space at the time. And it's 5 minutes past the hour of 6 o'clock in Dominica. That is where this program is being hosted from. Those of you in the regional space as well, good evening to you. And those of you further afield, blessed good evening, or some of you maybe it's even morning already. So whatever time of day it is in your neck of the wood, thank you very much for your eyes and ears each and every time. Yeah, it's the first day of December. Let's welcome December. And so basically the year is practically ended. And so yes, we welcome December tonight being the first night of December 2024 indeed. The program name is Civic Vibes. That is the program that is aired each and every Sunday from 6 o'clock, just about that time. And so we are here and we are ready to go. And we always appreciate your listening, your paying attention to this program each and every time. That is where information, the necessary education, and all that is good in terms of information we dispense here from 6 o'clock. So you are in tune for another very big program this evening. We have a well-respected brother, a very erudite brother, knowledgeable. He's well informed as to the topic that we're going to be discussing sometime later. And so we ask you now, please make yourself feel very comfortable at this time, because when things get going here, then we will not be slowing down just a bit. So we don't want you to miss a bit, because brother David Edwards, he's here, of senior former public servant in Dominica. He will be telling you just a bit more of himself in just a bit. But before we do that, though, let me move across to Brother Alvin Thomas, who was absent last week. Alvin, you're supposed to walk if you're excused. You know the Gulu deal, Alvin. You know, when you miss school, you're supposed to walk if you're excused.
Yeah. I know.
So thank you very much, Alvin. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Lofty. Good evening. And you're rubbing it in. You know, as an SMA old boy, we had two things that you get punished for. If you're late or absent, you might get a detention or a demerit. Detention was the worst. Demerit was a milder one. So it looked like you plan on giving me 2 detentions or 1 demerit. Which one?
Well, in my days, it took 5 demerits to get a detention. So you are piling up those demerits very well. So go ahead.
Oh man, it's good to be back, Lofty. Really good to be back. Missed last week, of course, took a little vacay. You know, sometimes you have to go out and re-energize, reconsolidate, reprogram, as they say. So I needed a little break off to go and, you know, just take a 5. So, but from what I heard, as always, the program was very good program. I went back and listened to it, as I would normally do. And it was quite a very interesting, quite informative program. So I'm happy to be back this Sunday. And like you said, we are quickly coming to the end of 2024. And the discussion that the conversation we're going to have this evening is so relevant, given that we've spent almost a whole 12 months of the year in doing certain things, both in our at an individual level, at a government level. The question is, how well did we do that? How accountable we were? What is the kind of governance that took place? So I think that the conversation is so on point this afternoon, and it's a pleasure to see my friend David Edwards there, one of senior public officers during my years in the public service. I'm sure, like me, he looks back and he says, oh my God, is that the same public service I used to be in? Or is that a different public service? So we'll hear a lot from him. I'm sure I'm going to learn quite a bit from him myself. Yes, let's just relax, sit back, grab a cup of coffee, juice, whatever. In my neck of the wood, it is what? It is about maybe a little over 40 something degrees. Okay. So I'll have to sip on a cup of hot tea for the next 2 hours. Yeah. But certainly a pleasure to be back, man.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Alvin. Good evening again to all our guests here. It's already 10 minutes past 6 o'clock. And so, yes, we're going to get into the meat of the discussion, as it were. Brother David Edwards, he's here with us. He will be telling you much more about himself in just a bit in terms of some of his introductory remarks here. But the topic on the microscope, as it were, or for the discussion later, it is topic good and accountable and transparent government or governance for the benefit of all, yes, all the people. Of late, folks, we have been hearing a number of things happening in, in the public service, as it were. And so, who's better to basically lend his voice, lend his experience, lend some of what he has learned to us when he was part of that service, other than Mr. David Edwards. So you guys are in tune for very informative discussion, I must add. And so without saying much more, let me just move across and welcome our very special guest here, Mr. David Edwards. Good evening to you, sir, and welcome to Civic Vibes. Are you there for the first time, sir?
Yes, good evening, Lofty, and good evening to your listeners, your many listeners. Yes, this is my first encounter with Civic Vibes. This is the first time I'm participating in the program. I've listened to your program, find it very interesting. Yeah. So when you invited me to be on, I was challenged to refuse.
I know. For some reason, well, I guess maybe Annie Edwards have been there for a number of times.
Oh yes,
Annie just second half, so I guess
yes.
that sort of nullifies it or equates it out. So yes,
absolutely.
Maybe we can say you were there as well, because absolutely. I know some of what she presented, you had some contribution to making that as well. But Brother Dave, let me just again thank you for coming on. I mean to say, a lot of times we hear in Dominica that we must speak. Persons who have the knowledge or the experience must speak. But these people, I can tell you, are far and few in between. And so whenever we have the presence of someone like you in here with us, we always want to tell you straight off the bat from Civic Vibes and the many viewing and listening, we appreciate a man like you in terms of presence. It's again, welcome. And in terms of some of your introductory remarks, as I said before, just give the people an idea just who is Mr. Dave and his vast experience, especially when the public service is concerned.
Okay, I like to start by telling people I'm just the son of a farmer. The son of a farmer who has had the benefit of a good education, a quality education, having graduated from Mona, UWI Mona, and having done postgraduate work at two of Britain's elite universities. Having been trained, I've had the opportunity to develop my skills along the way. I've had the opportunity to serve in the public sector. I did that for about 8 years at a senior level, serving as a program manager in the Ministry of Education, tasked with the transformation of the sector. And I also served in the office of the Permanent Secretaries, acting PS. But equally important, or probably, well, I won't say more important, but equally important, is that I've had a very extensive experience as a regional consultant, working with a number of regional governments, even doing things like sector analysis and strategic planning, having had the experience of working with some of the international development partners. You're talking about Commonwealth, you're talking about the World Bank, you're talking about UNESCO, and I've worked with a number of regional organizations, the OECS, CARICOM Development Bank, and name it. So along that journey, I have made my own assessment of practices, the soundness of practices, as well as the flaws in practices. I've had the opportunity to develop policy for other countries in the public sector policies. And so the views that I'll share tonight with your listeners are reflections on my own experiences of best practices and poor practices, and my conclusion as to what is better for the citizens
what is better for the citizens. Thank you very much
Yeah.
indeed. So, folks, yes, you heard Mr. Edwards. As I told you, he's a man of vast experience. And so, yes, we all are going to learn something tonight indeed. Alvin Thomas, you have been there yourself as part of that service that Brother Edwards alluded to earlier. So I will do most of the listening tonight, Alvin, and let you guys sort of, get it off the ground and give us really that solid foundation that we must build from as it relates to the information that is going to be dispensed tonight. So Alvin, yes, go right on.
Yeah, absolutely, lovely. Well, again, let me just say welcome to my friend and colleague, if I could say, Brother David Edwards. Myself, having worked in the public service for a number of years at senior level positions. That last position being that of Assistant Secretary in the Ministry of Tourism. That is one peg below the Permanent Secretary.
Mm-hmm.
And like David, we understand the role of the public service, the public sector, and what is required. And obviously, I'll be happy to hear his perspective tonight, as he did indicate the best practices, what he sees now, and based on what obtained, and to sort of juxtapose that against the question of good governance and accountability. Let me just start off by quoting from a UNDP sub-regional office of Barbados in the Eastern Caribbean. That's the United Nations Development Program. And they quote, "Without good governance, countries' achievement and maintenance of short and long-term sustainable economic, social, and political development is limited," unquote. That's the UNDP that's saying that. Without good governance, countries' achievement and maintenance of short and long-term sustainable economic, social, and political development is limited, unquote. And CEDA, which is the Canadian International Development Organization. Again, this is an organization that David, I'm sure, is well familiar with. CEDA made the point as it relates when they define good governance. Good governance as an exercise of power by various levels of government in a manner that is effective, honest, equitable, transparent, and accountable, unquote. CEDA, they're saying good governance, quote, as the exercise of power by various levels of government in a manner that is effective, honest, equitable, transparent, and accountable, unquote. So with those two quotes that I just referred to, the UNDP and CEDA, I would like David now to speak to the man on the street, because when we use those terms, we want to use it in a way that the ordinary man, as well as the guy with the PhD and the masters and everything, understands what is at stake and what we're talking about when we speak of good governance. So the average guy, Joe Blow, will say, "Oh, is that the meaning?" Tell us, David, how do you see that? And you ended your intro by mentioning one word, the people.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see good governance as something important that the people should be aware of? Break it down for us, as they say.
Thanks, Alvin. Well, it's important that the man on the street understands what we mean by government, and then understand governance from there. And it's important that the man on the street understand that what we're going to focus on tonight is the behavior of the executive, the way the executive conducts business. And I want to remind the man in the street that this country, the constitution of this country, says it shall be a sovereign democratic republic. That's what the constitution of this country says. And that republic has a system of government that is divided into 3 branches. You have the legislature, which is the parliament. That is the law-making body. So that's a branch of government, and its primary responsibility is to make law, but it also holds the executive accountable. And when we start talking about good governance, we have to clarify those roles. So you have the legislature, which is the parliament. And within that parliament, you have the House of Assembly. That is all the elected members and the senators, the 5 appointed by the winning party, the 4 appointed by the opposition. And you have the office of the president as part of that. And then you have the legislature. Sorry, you have judiciary, yeah. So we talk about the parliament, which is the legislative body, and you have the judiciary, which is that body that interprets the law, the court system. And then you have the executive or cabinet. The executive comprises the prime minister and his cabinet. And they are responsible for the day-to-day work of the government, implementing the law and embarking on programs for the well-being of the citizens. And when we enter a discussion on governance and the question as to whether or not governance is good or bad, or whether or not government is responsive to the needs of the citizens, we have to also be very clear as to where responsibility lies. And when we talk about transparency and accountability, we have to bear in mind the role of those 3 branches of government, because the executive is responsible for reporting to the parliament, the legislature. And just to give you an example why that is relevant in this discussion, we have had experiences over the past year whereby when questions are raised in the parliament on behalf of the citizens, the executive has been less than cooperative in answering those questions. So when we talk about transparency and accountability, it's important to understand those 3 branches, their functions, and the role of the executive and its accountability to parliament. So tonight, what we're going to look at is how the executive branch of government needs to operate in order that it meets the needs of the citizens. And we're talking about good governance, we're talking about accountability, we're talking about transparency. Now, the executive, we said, includes the prime minister and his cabinet. You may have junior ministers. The Constitution doesn't talk about junior ministers. It talks about parliamentary secretaries. That's what the Constitution talks about. But we seem to have a culture of departing from labels that are approved. The executive is responsible for implementing the law. It's responsible for implementing programs for the development of the country. It's responsible for getting into agreements for the well-being of the citizens, whether those agreements are things like United Nations Development Goals 2030 or United Nations Protocol on the Rights of the Child, or whether or not those are regional agreements. They are all meant to improve the lives of our people. Government, the executive is expected to implement programs, and it raises financial resources through taxes, through loans, through grants. It raises those on behalf of the people. And it's very important to clarify that to the listeners, that the grants, the loans, the taxes, the revenue collected are collected on behalf of the people. It isn't. So those resources do not belong to a party. They do not belong to the party in power. And they ought not to be used as if they are if the party in power is the owner of those resources. As a consequence, the executive has to account for those resources. The executive uses those resources, is supposed to use those resources to implement programs that are supported by estimates approved in Parliament and approved under an appropriation bill. The efficiency, effectiveness with which those programs are implemented are matters for which the executive must account to the people and to Parliament. I want to also stress that the public service is the implementation arm of the executive. That's what the Constitution provides for, a public service that is divided into departments as approved by law, each of which is headed by a permanent secretary. And there's a Public Service Commission that is responsible for the appointment and the discipline of personnel in those departments. And I want to stress that. Responsible for appointment and discipline, and also promotion or development, personal development. Because that is a role that is not for the executive. It's for a body called the Public Service Commission. There's also the Police Commission that has a similar role. The Police Commission is part of the Public Service Commission. Sorry, it's part of the Public Service, sorry. But the Public Service Commission deals with the public service, while the Police Service Commission deals with the police department. So the police department is also falling under the executive. So that is the context in which we're having this discussion, so that people understand the role of those three branches of government. Because when people talk about the government is doing this or the government is doing that, more often than not, they are referring to the manner in which the executive conducts business. But they have to understand that the executive is just one part of government. And the executive is not a law unto itself. The executive has to be held accountable. And there are provisions in the Constitution to make the executive accountable. But sometimes some actors in the executive tell the citizens that I run things. I am in charge of everything. That's not the intent of the Constitution of the sovereign republic. That's misinformation to the citizens. That is spreading confusion among citizens. That is an embracement of lawlessness. And so, as we proceed in this discussion, there's some points I'm going to labor to illustrate from my perspective some of the good practices that the executive needs to embrace so as to ensure that the expenditures that are undertaken by government and the activities that are implemented by government are driven by an interest in securing sustainable benefits for the citizens. And I want to stress that point. It's not benefits for party lackeys. It's not benefits for supporters. It's not benefit for friends. We are not talking about benefits for those for the loyalists who support the party in office. We're talking about benefits for all the citizens. That is the responsibility of government. The approach cannot be partisan. Nepotism is not good governance. Okay, so with those remarks, we've said that the role of the executive is to exercise responsibility for the day-to-day administration, to implement programs that are in the interest of the citizens, to raise revenue, to fund those programs, and to make sure they're equitable distribution. Let me also take a second to talk about accountability. When we talk about accountability for the man in the street, in simple terms, we are asking the executive to answer for performance. Now, accountability is not alien, it's not alien to the Dominican. Every day, Dominicans hold certain service providers accountable. They hold Dominic accountable. They hold teachers in the schools accountable for the performance of their students. They may even hold neighbors accountable. The issue of accountability must always be extended to government, because that is just an important pillar of democracy. And standard institutional practices for accountability include democratic elections. I want to stress democratic elections. It's different from just talking about having elections. The elections must be free and fair and free from fear. And the people must always have the option to change their government, change the members in parliament, if they so choose to. The people must always have that opportunity. So democratic elections, which sometimes provide a referendum on the conduct of business, that is one of the institutional practices. Legislative scrutiny, judicial review. And that's why I took time to mention the three branches of government. We talk about the judiciary. Well, judicial review is one of those institutional practices for accountability. Having audits, financial audits and performance audits. Our Constitution has a provision for a parliamentary commissioner. I will talk about that in more details later. That is one of the institutional provisions for accountability and transparency, but particularly accountability. More often than not, we refer to that office of the parliamentary commissioner as ombudsman, for those persons who may be confused tonight. And of course, regulations made by the executive and Alvin, the media, the press, especially in this digital age. The press is an important pillar in democracy, in holding governments accountable. I mean, you probably saw what some things that happened last week. There were publications and exhibits flying all over the media, and then in a couple of days, man, it was like a bonfire. We probably talk about those later. It shows the impact of the media, of even social media. But that is something we have to preserve and protect, because it ensures, as was displayed last week, how citizens can get a reversal on decisions. It shows the power of the people. It shows the power of the people. Okay, so let's talk about some of those things, some of those practices that...
Well, David,
sure.
Before you go into the practices, I know you've covered quite a bit. I want you to, before you move to the practices, I want you to go back a little and stick to the executive and the public service before we get to that. Because as you rightly mentioned, the three branches being the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive are indeed important. And you mentioned the public service and the police service. And there are several others we could mention. And of course, you have not yet touched, which I'm sure you will, various legislations. When these guardrails are removed, which I'm sure, again, you will deal when you're referring to the practices, I want you to paint a relationship between the executive and the public service. Because the executive, as you said, is the cabinet of ministers as the executive. Now, there is this quote from a senior Canadian permanent secretary, which says, while government and ministers come and go, permanent secretaries remain the permanent custodian of permanent problems. So the point I'm trying to make is that you may have a government come into office, they have a 5-year term, they get elected, and next election, a new government takes over. But that public service that you mentioned, which is made up permanent secretaries and all the various technocrats and all that remains. That's the system we have, which is what obtains individuals.
All right, Alvin, I don't know, but your
Everybody else
audio
goes
seems
with
cracking
whoever
up.
is going, the president.
Breaking up. So if you can just kind of bring the point home and then pass it back to Ms. Ed. Yes.
Okay. So I need you, therefore, to spend some time in terms of the relationship between the public service and the executive.
Yes. So the public service is the implementation arm of the policies of the executive. As we said, the executive is responsible for the day-to-day administration. It's responsible for policies. It's responsible for the law. It's responsible for ensuring the rule of law, that everyone is equal before the law. Everyone. Everyone, you know, and the so in terms of the professional relationship, that public service is responsible for implementation, and the officers within that public service are responsible for reporting to the executive through the heads of department, which is really the permanent secretary. Of course, the permanent secretary can delegate some responsibility for reporting. So we have a situation where the executive makes policy decisions and sets priorities. The public service is supposed to implement, but the public service is required to be professional. A good public service is an entity where people are professional. And what that means is the culture of the public service should be a culture that nurtures professionalism. And that translates into honest feedback to the executive. The public service has institutional knowledge. It has expertise. It has professionals. The public service has officers who are experts in their field, experts by virtue of training and experience. The executive, our experience is that more often than not, the executive is not saddled with professional expertise. It varies. Some governments, some elections bring more professionals to office than others. But it is not uncommon, and no disrespect to ministers who may be listening. It is not uncommon for you to have some ministers overseeing certain ministries, what the Constitution referred as departments, without expertise in that field. Now, in terms of the interests of the citizens, it is very good for the posture of the minister to be one that encourages honest feedback and openness and professional advice from those who are so trained and positioned to give it. And you can have quite the opposite. You can have a situation where somebody say, I am the minister and what I say goes. We have to be careful about that. And that is not an uncommon experience. Because what I say goes might be a case of infringement on the law. And so public servants have a responsibility to ensure that the rules of the public service are not broken, and more importantly, that they do not engage in actions that are illegal. Now, we've seen situations where the executive has taken steps to neutralize public servants who are bent on being professional and bent on not getting themselves involved in illegal actions. And some ministers have used their power, not the authority, but their power to neutralize such persons. And that those actions sometimes translate into staff movements. They translate into engagements of persons on contracts who are given quite a lot of authority and power. And sometimes they result in dismissal. And one of the ways that members of the executive or the head of the executive chooses to create a public service that is that feels vulnerable is to get involved in appointment, selection, and recruitment, which is the role of the Public Service Commission, and to ensure that some public servants are not appointed or do not enjoy mobility. And a practice of keeping public servants in a situation where they are not appointed on the establishment is certainly a tool to force them to comply with the wishes of the executive, because it creates a sense of insecurity. I mean, someone is in an acting position, and anecdotal evidence suggests to me that we have a Hollywood-type situation in the current public service, where there are so many people acting that it compares to the situation in Hollywood. That's deliberate. That is not accidental. That is all aimed at ensuring that the public servants in question are vulnerable, and so they are more malleable and can be made more compliant with the wishes of members of the executive. But they should ensure that they do not engage in illegal actions, and they follow the provisions of the rules and regulations, the general orders, and all of that stuff. So ideally, there should be a very amicable relationship between the executive and the public service, because the public service is the implementation arm. But there should be honesty, there should be a display of integrity, and there should be a display of professionalism. Because if there's this harmonious relationship, then it's all well and good for the citizens. And at the end of the day, public servants have to understand that if they break the law, they're responsible. They're accountable. Yeah, so that's my response to what you asked.
Okay, okay. I Lofty, you have Lofty, anything you want to come in?
No, the conversation can flow still. Go right on. Thanks.
Okay, all right. So let's move to some of the practices you wanted to mention earlier.
Yes.
Let's move to some of the practices.
So let's talk about some of those practices that can secure good, transparent, and accountable government conduct that would benefit the citizens. The first one I want to look at is data-driven decision-making. So we spoke about the executive being responsible for the day-to-day operations, the executive implementing programs, projects, and other interventions or initiatives that are aimed at making the difference, a positive difference in the lives of citizens. Data-driven decision-making is a key pillar of good governance. And data and decisions that are not based on data and information are the main contributors to waste. So data-driven decision-making is likely to optimize the benefits of citizens, the benefits that citizens enjoy. All right, so talking about good governance, when last did you see a national census report? I haven't seen a recent national census report. How do we know how many persons we should plan for in Dominica? Every time we talk about the population in Dominica, you hear people talking about, they give responses like 55,000, probably 65, 72,000. And some people tell you, I don't even think Dominica has 55,000 people. The anecdotal evidence points to heavy outward migration. We know that. We know that because there's one thing that is very visible to us if we have children or if we live close to schools. The enrollment in the school system, both primary and secondary, enrollment is on a continuous decline. So we know the resident population is decreasing from year to year. We know there's heavy outward migration. We don't have, we have not got into a habit of a good census cycle. So we have no credible data on the output of our productive sectors, agriculture, tourism, you name it. We don't know the size of our domestic market for the important commodities. Failure to understand and publish a national census report is irresponsible. And that is just striking evidence of bad governance. Further, it impacts the macro level planning and development of both the public sector and the private sector. At the end of the day, all citizens suffer because we end up taking, we end up with activities that are not based on data. So these activities just translate into total waste. So data-driven decisions is critical. And good governance requires the executive to ensure that decisions are based on data and information. Informed decisions. Another point I want to mention is that the programs, projects, and other innovations that are undertaken by the executive, those ought to be carefully planned. If they are based on adequate and relevant data, they offer two main advantages. They're more likely to have outcomes that translate into sustainable benefits for citizens. That's one. Sustainable benefits for citizens. And equally important is that programs and projects and other initiatives that are carefully planned save taxpayers' money, and that save, when you talk about the saving of taxpayers' money, that is very important when you consider the resource-constrained environment in which we operate. I want to cite some examples. Let's reflect on some examples. The cruise ship berth at Portsmouth that was built by the Eugenia Charles administration has for the most part been a white elephant. One of the issues there is that there was an opportunity cost for the monies used for that investment, in the sense that those monies could have been used to do other activities that could have been of greater benefit to the citizens. Obviously, that undertaking was not properly guided. But let's look at some more recent examples. The Morocco Hotel in Portsmouth, very close to the cruise ship berth. The Morocco Hotel, that has proved to be a complete disaster because the decision makers did not see the need for necessary studies. Remember, even if it was financed by grants, those were monies for the citizens of Dominica. So we're talking about programs and projects, interventions on behalf of the people. And we're talking about resources, financial resources, whether they're grants, whether they're loans, whether they are monies secured from taxes. A Morocco Hotel was built and is today a complete disaster, not functional, will never be functional, because those who took a decision to implement that undertaking saw no need for the relevant data that would guide the decision. So you have a poorly planned initiative that is today an ISO and an environmental hazard. Let's take another example. A pet subject of many Dominicans. Because we're talking about good governance and how government needs to operate so that citizens benefit, so that there's not waste, unnecessary waste in the use of resources. Because when you have over expenditures, when you have cost overruns, you're talking about opportunities, squandered opportunities, in the sense that those resources could have been used differently for the benefits of the Dominican people. Let's look at the international airport. I know it's a subject dear to your heart, Alvin. We have not seen an environmental impact assessment. We have been told that one exists. There is a legal requirement to have it published, to make it available to the citizens. We know, we are aware, we heard that the Prime Minister said he has the report, but that report has never been made public. Why isn't it on the Dominica website? Why isn't there a website for the international airport where all relevant documents are made available for the citizens so that they can comment, they can give feedback, they can see the progress on the venture, they can read the documents and make their own interpretations. They can give feedback to the executive. Feedback helps to fine-tune initiatives. So we've heard that the EIA for the airport was undertaken. Many people believe that it was not properly conducted in terms of the standards. It seems like the decision maker said, okay, you all want EIA? Well, look on EIA. They failed to demonstrate appreciation for the fact that the EIA is an absolute necessity that informs the design of the undertaking. What is worse is that development activities on the airport, such as the clearing of land, were commenced before essential technical studies were undertaken. And to date, our understanding is that some of those technical studies are not complete.
So Mr. Edwards, just a button a bit. We have to take a break in just a while because it's already 7 o'clock. Where, based on for example, the subject matter here on the airport project, where does some of the public servants now come into that whole scheme of things as it relates to accountability and transparency based on what we have been talking about? All right, yeah. but just hold on to your answer. Let's take that all important break at this time. We'll come right back for your answer and to entertain some calls. Let's do this. We'll be back in just a bit. Thank you. That's King Dice. He calls this one Fire Bondam. Just in case you're tuning in at this time.
The money controllers in the country. Fire Bondam.
It is 7 o'clock in Dominica and the region.
Those who see the truth as their enemy.
And we're talking to Mr. David Edwards.
Bondam. Come to the churches, they corrupted.
On the whole important topic of good and accountable government.
They get to you too, so one day they can send them to kill somebody. And they targeting me because they know I know where they're coming from. Maliciously keeping me up the show, obeying me not to perform. But I'm seeing from up.
So far, so good.
Our ancestors before we to build the country.
The important role of all the public servants in Dominica in terms of holding the executive, as I said, accountable to the people.
Standing for country.
So the numbers to call into the Civic Vibes program, they are on your screen as we speak. So after that break, you can make that all important call to chime in onto the conversation. Mr. Arundel Thomas, good evening to you, my bro. And to all of you listening and watching on YouTube at this time.
Contract kickbackers, lovers of money. Fire upon them, fire upon them. Architects of the people's poverty. Fire upon them, fire upon them. Businessmen crying tears, yeah, they've seen $1 million. Civic profit makers some ambitious, overnight millionaires, who are willing to do whatever it takes to maintain their position. 40 years celebration, no Calypsonian invited to perform. But I sing for my brothers, sing of our ancestors before we. Those who build the country and help their dignity.
Just a comment coming in here
No secret society, no political party, go
from Mr. Arundel Thomas, listening and locked in.
sell out my country.
He said, I endorse David's observation that the data-driven decisions are key to program success. For example, he writes, there are a comprehensive evaluation and study of the Universal Secondary Education Program under United Workers' Party government undertook this study at Grand Bay and Grand Bay Secondary School, now Pierre Charles Secondary. It continues by saying the objective was to determine how to proceed with efficiency, clarity, and maximum success in the gradual expansion of use, that is universal secondary education. When this DLP government assumed office, they completely set aside and ignored the study and the findings. The result of their rash decisions to make every secondary universal without giving consideration to findings is evident in the unclear and tenuous situation in our secondary school system. Those are some of the thoughts of Mr. Arundel Thomas here, as per his contribution to the program tonight.
So you won't want to turn things around and return to our glory days. But I'll sing for my brothers.
All right, folks, let's get back to Mr. Edwards on the live link here with us. Mr. Edwards, again, you were about to go into the question that I asked you earlier in terms of the project, the airport project, for example. What about the public officers who supposed to, hold things tight so that accountability and transparency could be derived?
Okay, there are a number of key stakeholders in the public service who are expected to have an interest in that undertaking. So there are a number of public sector key stakeholders. And what they ought to do on behalf of the citizens of this country, and for just a matter of ensuring that the margins for error are limited, or just simply saying ensuring that the government does not look bad. These stakeholders ought to have taken an interest and document their recommendations to the head department in a way that gets to the executive, whether they pass those through their permanent secretaries or whether they seek an audience with the members of the executive whose aid they have. So some of those stakeholders are the Ministry of Finance, the senior people in the Ministry of Finance. The Ministry of Finance is resourced with persons who are trained in economics. And a key requirement for an initiative like an international airport is a financial and economic feasibility study. I mean, for God's sake, one was a financial and economic feasibility study was completed by Sir Alexander Gibbs when the Eugenia Charles administration gave thought to a the development of an airport at Compton Point. If you go to the documentation center, you can access the Sir Alexander Gibbs report. There are 2 volumes. And in there, if you read those reports, there is a financial and economic feasibility study as part of those reports. And you ask yourself, why, over 30 years after, we are taking a much bigger undertaking than what was envisaged in Compton Point. And we've started it without a financial and economic feasibility study that is shared with the public. So not only are we talking about an EIA, we don't have a financial and economic feasibility report on the initiative. So the economists and the finance persons, especially those trained in development finance, those persons in the Ministry of Finance ought to have sought an audience and can still do that at this point in time. How are we going to ensure that this undertaking is viable? Another set of stakeholders are those who are supposed to be guardians of the environment, those persons in the ministry responsible for the environment who are supposed to advise and ensure that the policies that are undertaken are policies that protect the environment. We boast of that we're a nature island. We talk about a pristine environment, yet the undertaking in the Northeast is one that is destructive to the environment. Again, those persons should make their views known. And let's talk about the fisheries. There seems to be a false sense of comfort by most Dominicans. They see this issue as a Northeast issue, or more specifically a Wesley issue. But the siltation that is taking place on the Atlantic coast of Wesley is going to impact the corals all over the island from north to south, because we're as an island, we're just a small rock. It's going to be distributed all over. It's not going to say, okay, this coral is not located at Wesley, so it's exempt. It's going to affect all the planktons on which the fishes feed. It's going to affect our dolphins and our whales. And so the people of tourism have a stake. So I'm giving you 4 examples of stakeholders that are supposed to make their voice known, that are supposed to make recommendations, that are supposed to find ways to work with the members of the executive who are giving policy directives to them and whose ear they have. I had an experience in one of the countries in the region where I worked, and the minister, who is now a High Court judge at the Eastern Caribbean Court of Appeal, he may be listening. His functionaries, those in his ministry, said he was a very difficult person to work with. And they said, you don't know the minister. I found it very easy to listen to the minister. I found it very easy to work with the minister. I found it very easy to have conversations with the minister. I found the minister very open to my policy recommendations to him. I was a consultant to that government. And without exception, all my policy recommendations were accepted by the minister. So the point I'm making is that, yes, you can have difficult members of the executive. Members of the public service are professionals. And one of the things they have to learn to do is to work with people and to provide their professional advice. Now, having said all of that, the caveat is there are some arrogant people in cabinet. There will always be a few arrogant persons, and there will always be people in cabinet who don't want to hear the voices of some public servants. But one of the things those public servants can do is put their opinions on paper.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that, David. I'm so glad you got to that point because I'm listening all along. And when you say, for example, the legal requirement has not been met for the EIA, the law's been broken and all that stuff, which is true. The point that you just make is so important because I think what our listeners need to understand, and the man on the street, you mentioned the executive. So a group, a political party, whatever name you call it, feel that they can represent the people. So they put themselves up for elections. They say, I'm going to build houses. I'm going to give you a railway. I'm going to give you a pie in the sky. I'm going to give you a submarine, blah, blah, blah. They got elected. Once they get elected now, they want to do some of the things that they're going to do, more, or not even do any of it. But they are a political animal. That's what they are.
Yep.
9 out of 10 times, they don't understand or are familiar, as you said, with the laws. Because there are a variety, an array of laws, public service regulation, finance, administration, legislation, procurement, you name it, planning. They're not aware of that. They come to the minister comes now, the minister responsible, let's say, for health. And he comes and he tells his permanent secretary, which again, incidentally, that's an office. That's an office in the Constitution by law and under the Finance Act. And let me just, for purposes of those listening, when the budget is passed in the House and it is finalized, it gets out, it goes to the Minister of Finance, who's responsible. You then have a financial secretary who then appoints an accounting officer, which in most cases is the permanent secretary. This individual is the one under the law that is responsible, not the minister.
Absolutely.
The minister is just responsible for overall direction of the ministry.
Absolutely.
But if, say, for example, $100,000 is missing, it is this permanent secretary that has to report to the Public Accounts Committee, to the Director of Audit, and under the law to say this is how that $100,000 was spent or not spent. To the extent that this permanent secretary, under the law, under Section 44 of the financial regulations, can be surcharged. And under that same regulation, based on what you just said, Section 10 of the financial regulations, which forms part of the Finance Administration Act 4 of 1994. Listen to what it says. If an accounting officer disagrees with his minister upon a matter of importance affecting the financial administration of his department, he shall put his objection in writing and place on record his disagreement with the minister's decision. It goes on to say, if the minister adheres to his decision, the accounting officer shall accept it and act thereon only on written instructions of the minister. So if the minister is saying, you must do it, you, the accounting officer, the PS, tell the minister, put it in writing for me, under the law. Making reference to such ruling if the need arises for him to defend his action. Copies of the objection and his minister's instruction shall be forwarded immediately to the minister and the director of audit. So I'm saying all of this to say that I subscribe to a lot of what you have said so far, but we must not let these permanent secretaries slip under the bus. Because as you said, the executive is part of the administration, and they have in place now the public service, which is made up of permanent secretary, heads of departments, and they are charged with that responsibility. and they're abdicating on that. Because at the end of the day, they're answerable. The minister simply goes back 5 years later to the people and say, hey, vote me again, I'll give you more schools or I'll give you more houses. So I think that is so important that where we are today, part of the problem has to do with the abdication of the responsibility of those accounting officers.
Right, absolutely. And I mentioned some of the stakeholders in the airport project, and of course the Ministry of Finance and the Financial Secretary is a key stakeholder.
Critical.
Because we have a situation where an initiative is being implemented and it is not informed by the technical studies. And so the technical studies are not completed, and so you don't know the nature of the problems, and so you can't design solutions. And if you can't design solutions, then you don't know cost. You
Absolutely.
don't know cost.
Absolutely.
Oh, the end result is that your undertaking may never be realized. The product may never be completed because you don't know cost. And what have we seen? We have seen a significant increase in the estimated cost in recent times. And we're now talking about $1.6 billion. Well, the studies are still incomplete. We could very well be talking about $3 billion in a few months. That's the reality. Now, that is gross irresponsibility on the part of the executive. It's gross irresponsibility on the part of the executive. And the people in the Ministry of Finance ought to have expressed their own opinion on those risks that are not in the interest of taxpayers. Dominicans need to understand that when politicians undertake unnecessary risk, taxpayers are burdened with the cost. So you could very well have secured an airport for probably $750 million, probably $500,000. And what happens if you end up securing a product that costs $3 billion when you might have completed it for $700 million? That additional cost is not going to be paid by the executive, you know. It's going to be, the taxpayers are going to be saddled with that for generations. And that impacts the availability of financial resources for health, for education, for critical infrastructure, for development of the productive sectors. It impacts education. It impacts everything. It also impacts salaries, because if government is burdened with obligations for loan repayment, then it's not in a position to compensate its workers as well as they ought to be compensated. So again, the issue here is programs, projects, and other innovations that are not carefully planned. That's just one example. So the best practice we're referring to is plan those carefully, have those driven by data, get all the professional advice, get all the technical studies. I want to move on to a similar best practice. Well, before I go to that, let me talk about selection and retention of personnel. It's important that the executive understand that successful implementation is only possible if they are effectively managed, if they are efficiently managed. And that means that the executive must ensure that the best available talents are secured and retained. That requires a transparent recruitment process that is merit-based. That is merit-based. an affinity for recruitment that targets party lackeys and loyalists will result in inefficiencies in implementation and poor end products and services. And again, these do not help taxpayers. So personnel should be carefully selected. The best talents should be recruited and retained. And it shouldn't be like something that is on the streets. My pal rep sent me. Okay, so let me go to selection of service providers, because that's a very important,
Lofty, you wanted to come in before he moved there?
Dave talked about or touched on a letter earlier. I just want to make sure that we have enough time to touch on that letter, Dave, in terms of the accountability that we're speaking of. The letter that surfaced where, after the media pushed it out, that we saw some backpedaling being done. So Dave, go right ahead, but I want to punch that letter to you and get your views as to really and truly who was or maybe is still responsible.
All right.
As to the public service we're talking about.
We will probably need 5-10 minutes for that one, right?
Yes, sure.
Okay. But I want to talk about the very important subject of procurement, because it's an area that attracts corruption, and it's an activity that can be mismanaged in a way that is extremely costly to the citizens, and in ways that ensure citizens do not benefit. So I'm going to spend some time talking about selection of service providers. And I'm talking about procurement. So from time to time, the executive will find it necessary to engage service providers, whether those are for construction activities, whether those are for consultancy activities, whether those are for the supply of goods. Service providers will be engaged, because the public service will never have all the skills that are required for implementation of programs. And so government engages service providers through a procurement process. So the issue of public procurement is very important to citizens and the way government conducts that. But poor procurement practices result in unnecessary costs to citizens. So, for example, a government may decide to build a school that can be completed for completed in 12 months, say at a cost of 15 million. However, you may have a case where a decision is taken to give a contract to a supporter who probably is a financial contributor to the party in power. I'm talking about a hypothetical case. And taxpayers end up paying $50 million for the product after 3 years. So you have a situation where the product may have been completed in 1 year at a cost of 15 million, and then it goes on, it drags on. By the time it is complete, it's 2 years, it's 3 years, and the cost is 3 times the cost at which it could have been completed had there been a proper procurement process. Now, what happens in a case like that? In a case like that, the education and training of the students who are supposed to attend that school, that their education and training is destroyed because they are not able to access the curriculum offerings, the best curriculum offerings. They are not able to access hands-on learning. They're not able to access TVET rooms or science labs. And probably they've been asked to stay at home and take classes online. Now, you may have a situation where those students come from the poorest community. You may have a situation where those students do not even have internet at home. You may have a situation where those students do not have the proper devices. And all because of poor procurement practices that are influenced by partisan interests and nepotism, the education of those kids is compromised. And the citizens need to be aware of those things. So it is in the interest of citizens that the executive undertake robust and transparent procurement practices that secure, for example, proper airport projects or schools, and that the best skills are secured for those, so that if you have a situation where you are undertaking say an airport project, you want to make sure you have a procurement process with robust criteria. You want criteria such as experiences undertaking a similar project with comparable scope and complexity. So you want the firms to show that they have such experience. They've undertaken, say, 3 projects with similar scope and complexity over the last 5 years. You want to ensure that the firms that are secured have the financial capability to, say, pay their to meet the salaries of their workers for a 6-month period if they're not paid, and meet material costs. You want to ensure that those firms have the managerial capacity. You want to ensure that those firms have experience working in a similar environment. For example, having undertaken projects in the Caribbean. And when I talk about undertaking projects with similar scope and complexity, you're building an airport for God's sake. So you can't be talking about selecting firms that have limited the experience to construction of railways. And what you would do in this public procurement process that is undertaken on behalf of the taxpayers is that you would shortlist those firms, the firms that meet all these robust criteria, and then you would invite proposals from those firms that are shortlisted. But you can compromise the process by ensuring you do not have robust selection criteria. You can compromise the process by interference by cabinet.
Yeah.
And all these do not augur well for the taxpayers.
All right. Thank you very, very much indeed, Brother Edwards here.
I want to make a comment when you're done, Lofty, on this letter.
Okay. All right. Dave, thank you very much for your delivery so far in terms of holding people in the public service in particular accountable. I took note earlier that you said that the permanent secretary is basically the head or is the leader, the person, the accounting officer of whatever ministry he or she is operating from. And let us get down to a specific situation at hand, which has basically blossomed in Dominica and much talked about that situation for the past couple of days, week. It is that situation, Dave, where a vehicle was approved by the Minister of Finance, and the Minister of Finance is none other than Mr. Irving McIntyre. And whilst I read that letter to you, Dave, can you zero in on the specifics of that letter, and in your mind, you work there, you should know certain things that should have gone on. Read that letter and the correspondences to follow. It says here, that is on the letterhead of the Ministry of Finance, Economic Development, Climate Resilience, and Social Security. It says from the financial secretary. So that letter is coming from that person, whoever he or she is. To the permanent secretary, that name came up a couple of times tonight, in the office of the Prime Minister. So our listeners and viewers have to get it right in that quote, that memorandum came from the financial secretary to the PS in the office of the Prime Minister. And it states, on November 11, 2024, subject approval to purchase a vehicle. The Honorable Minister of Finance has approved the purchase of a vehicle to be used for this transportation of the children of the Honorable Prime Minister. It continues by saying the vehicle to be purchased at J. Astor Funds and Company Limited at a cost of $184,500 EC dollars. Expenditure to be met under the recurrent head, and it gives the specific head. Please be guided accordingly. And some person by the name of Natalie Louis Hippolyte signed that letter on behalf of or for the financial secretary. And even greater importance that a lot of people have not taken note of, that letter was copied to the Accountant General and also to the Director of Audit. When that letter got into the ears and eyes of a lot of people, especially people in the media and Dominicans by extension, Dave, it created a stir. And as you said, thank God for the media in terms of the performing the role to hold government accountable. There was this sort of washing of the hands, as it were, by the person who that vehicle was supposed to be used for in terms of just the children of that Prime Minister. So Dave, you were there. Before I even go through the rest of the letters in terms of responses, the state, as it is clearly stated, has no responsibility towards the children or any child of any sitting Prime Minister. From just that memo, Dave, it was copied to the audit department and also to the Director of Audit and the Accountant General. Just from that, were there any laws broken just from that communique? And if there were, who in your mind was and maybe is still responsible?
Okay, a very interesting case, and I'm familiar with the documentation that has been floating through the media.
Yes.
Okay, so let me say one. The individual who signed that letter is not a senior officer. Meaning it's not. So that officer carried out an instruction that was given.
Okay.
Right? And that instruction came from above. That instruction would have come from above. That officer would not have signed that letter unless that officer was directed to sign it and the officer felt that she had no choice. Probably the officer may not have had the confidence to say, are we on the right track, or question the legality or the illegality of the activity which this document was actually instructing to be undertaken. So, so that is what I'd say in terms of the sign-in. That officer had instructions from above. That officer says that the memo was coming from the financial secretary. It would seem to me that those instructions came from a higher office. My interpretation, my own gut feeling was that these instructions came from the office of the Minister of Finance. That's how I would interpret this. This is my interpretation of this thing. Now, you asked me, were there any laws broken? This is my view. My view is that the state has no provisions, no legal provisions for provision of transportation services to the children of the minister or the children of the president or the children of any other office holder. So I would say yes, the laws were broken. That is my view. My view is that the laws were broken because there are no legal provisions. And if there are no legal provisions, there couldn't be budgetary provisions for this activity. So, in my view, the laws were broken. In my view, this is a wrong. Yes.
Okay, so in your view,
you're going to add something.
Yes. I was just going to add to what you're saying. So in your view, you're saying something went awry, and I heard you stress on that junior officer who signed that letter. That letter, it is also indicating that it was copied to the accountant general and also to the director of audit. Shouldn't have one of these departments through their heads picked up on that, what you are suggesting now, Dave, that a law was broken and intervened then? A matter of fact, to sort of firm up everything, I'm seeing a stamp of the audit department on that, on the top right of that letter as well. So here it is, 2 other offices. That letter met them. And not even they, and I'm hoping they were not junior people in those positions, saw that letter and said nothing, did nothing. A matter of fact, they sanctioned it by stamping it.
Well,
giving it the approval.
Okay, I'd say 2 things in that. One is that the people, the officers to whom this was copied would have seen it. They would have seen it. Now, they stamp to acknowledge receipt. That does not mean they approve of the action.
Okay.
Right? So they stamp to acknowledge receipt. Now, it is possible that they gave feedback.
Okay.
It is also possible, remember, this letter, my interpretation, well, based on my experience, I would say this letter was not seeking approval from those officers. It was just letting them know that when the bills come in, the bills have to be processed because the expenditure was authorized.
Okay.
Now, I would expect that the auditor, when the auditor general is doing his auditing at the end of the year, he would have to look at the budget and the law, and he is obliged to say that this was, in my view, he is obliged to say that this expenditure is not in keeping with the provisions of the law. But that is after the fact. Now, in terms of the role of the officers who were copied on this, I would say they have a professional obligation to reach the Ministry of Finance and raise reservations about the lawfulness of this exercise, because they have a budget before them, and they ought to be saying, "Hey, wait a minute. I think this is my opinion on this." Now, probably they did that. Probably they did that. It is also possible that they are so comfortable with wrongdoings that they saw it as, well, you know, whatever is approved upstairs, we do.
Okay, so Dave, to come back to the scenario that you laid at our feet earlier, you said that the PSCs and the accounting officers, these people, they are basically responsible for their department.
They are.
I am seeing here a minister, the Minister of Finance, basically went ahead, said his ministry approved that money for the purchase of a vehicle for the transportation of the Prime Minister's children. Now, going back to what you said earlier, shouldn't the permanent secretary in that office have stepped in and say, "Mr. Minister, how could you go ahead and approve that money? Because that is not keeping with law." Your take.
Okay. You are right. The permanent secretary in that ministry should, let me put it this way, the permanent secretary in that ministry has a professional responsibility to advise the minister and should have done that. Now, I don't know, we cannot say whether or not that person did that.
Okay.
It may be that that person did that. But what we can say is that that person has a professional responsibility to advise the minister, because that person would be more acquainted with the financial regulations than the minister. So if that person did not advise the minister, that person was irresponsible. Now, is it possible that, okay, looking at the document, okay, yeah, what I was going to say does not matter. So that person may have done that. It is also possible that this was done when the appropriate functionary, the functionary who has the expertise in guiding the ministry, this decision could have been taken and implemented when the functionary who has the appropriate skills and knowledge was absent from office. Because what we see is the letter dated November 11th was signed by a mid-level or junior person who was signing for somebody else. It doesn't mean that the somebody else would have actually signed the letter. That's not necessarily so. It may be that the somebody else was out of office. It may be that the somebody else didn't even know that this thing was done until the somebody else.
Well, Edwards, that to me even raises much more questions than what that met the eye earlier. But Alvin, yes.
Yeah, Lofty, let me see if I can in a short space of time throw my spin on it and try to put this in context. Let's start off with the letter of 11th of November, okay? First of all, the way the system operates, the government, the parliament passed a budget for 2022, 2025, whatever that is. They pass the budget. They say they have various line items. We're going to spend $500 there. We want to buy a new vehicle there. We want to do this, X, Y, Z. That budget, it goes under the control now of the Minister of Finance,
Mhm.
who has a financial secretary, who now that financial secretary gives authority to accounting officers. Each permanent secretary now is allowed to spend. So in that scenario, based on what I'm reading, an amount presumably was estimated for 130 or thereabout, 132,000 for the vehicle. Okay? When time come to buy the vehicle, they realized that money was short. So what you can do in the ministry, you can do what is called apply for environment warrant.
Mhm.
So the ministry has its budget and it has a certain amount. Now, let's say, for example, on the police, which falls under, let's say, the Prime Minister's office, police has some extra or surplus. You could then apply a environment warrant and say, I'm short of $52,000 to put with that 132 or 50,000. Let us via $50,000 from that budget of police line and put with that 132 to give me that 182. So the ministry now who is making that purchase, which happens to be the office of the Prime Minister, where the vehicle is being purchased, would apply to the Ministry of Finance for that environment. So it stands to reason that the Prime Minister's office is aware of the purchase.
Yeah, I agree.
Knows of the vehicle.
Yeah.
And wants to buy the vehicle.
Yeah.
And they're saying we are short by X amount and we need a environment warrant to get the difference.
And they'd have to give the justification for the
Right.
environment.
Now, under the Finance and Audit Act, again, regulation, sorry, which forms part of the Finance Act 4 of 1994. It says there in section 63, if funds provided under a division are found insufficient to meet expenditure which is unavoidable, an application for environment warrant in the prescribed form may be made by the ministry concerned to the financial secretary. It does not say to the Minister of Finance, to the financial secretary, because remember, as I said, once the budget is approved, it falls under the control of the financial secretary under the law.
Yeah.
The minister is just the overall direction, but it's the financial secretary.
Yeah, that is
For
correct.
environment between division under the same head, subject to the approval of the financial secretary, environment warrant may be issued authorizing environment between the divisions concerned. So therefore, that letter of 11th of November was on the basis that something came from the office of the Prime Minister, the permanent secretary there, Missy Henderson, as the PS, the accounting officer, saying to the financial secretary, we want to purchase this vehicle. We are short by $52,000. We need a environment warrant. The financial secretary will say, okay, yes, go ahead and approve it, and then send back to the Prime Minister's office and say, it's been approved, go ahead and buy the vehicle. Okay? Now, so therefore, the letter of 11th November, which is signed by Ms. Hippolyte, ought not to have read the Honorable Minister of Finance has approved. It should more appropriately read that the financial secretary has approved. The minister has got a role in there. The financial secretary is the one that approved the environment warrant, not the minister. So when you come now to the letter of November 25th, from the Prime Minister to the permanent secretary in his office, which is Mr. Henderson, and he says there, it has been brought to my attention that the vehicle purchased by the office of the Prime Minister as to transport my children, and giving the impression that he's not aware is a little disingenuous, because the accounting officer would have had conversation with his minister and say, Mr. Minister, we want to get that and we are short. and therefore I'm going to apply to the financial secretary environment to make up the difference. And then now, when the minister comes now with his letter saying November 28th, which is after the Prime Minister memorandum, and he says there, the Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit was not involved in this decision and has instructed that his children will not be used, blah, 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 blah. That also is disingenuous.
Yeah, that is disingenuous. Yeah.
Because again, as I'm saying, the minister, which happens to be the Prime Minister, where the permanent secretary, which is Miss Henderson, was part of that conversation, would have communicated to the financial secretary, and the financial secretary would have given approval. Now, you asked a question about the audit. It's merely for information. The audit will subsequently report in his or her report the findings, whether this was a violation of the law or not. But I will also go further to state that the caption or the statement of the minister's memorandum of November 28th says, procurement of vehicle by the office of the Prime Minister. You notice too, in that memorandum, he made no mention of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Property Act number 14 of 2021, which earlier they've mentioned. Because if you're getting a vehicle of that amount, the question remains, was it tendered in keeping with the provision of Act 14 of 2021? Was there an open tender? Was there a bid? In other words, was it only Astor funds that had to bid on the vehicle? Did we go to these 3 other vehicle vendors you have? And how did you arrive to have one vendor as the person to provide the vehicle? So the whole thing is
a mess.
Is a mess. It violates protocol. It violates procedure. It interferes with the law. It gives the bad impression of no transparency. And I think that speaks to what Dave has been saying earlier. The whole question of accountability and governance, and what is the role of permanent secretaries in particular as accounting officers of the ministry.
Alvin, thank you very much. Well put in terms of your deliberations here. I know a lot of people, they basically benefited from you breaking it down so that they could understand out there. We have very, very limited time. But Dave, you spoke about the judiciary.
Right.
Whatever we have been discussing there, the last aspect, the last segment, how can the people now get redress for, you said, Alvin agreed, I am in agreement, the breaking of some law? How can the people now get redress as it pertains to that specific matter? And then we close.
Okay. Ideally, the parliamentary commissioner should be in place. But that's a provision of the Constitution. There is an office for parliamentary commissioner, deputy, and staff for the parliamentary commissioner. That's the ombudsman. But successive governments have ignored that aspect of the Constitution. It's difficult to get redress on something of this nature. I personally think that the Treasury ought to be immediately reimbursed. And I believe that it's the work of the press and the citizens expressing their voice that would force the Treasury, force reimbursement of the Treasury. We I'm not sure how the judiciary could get involved in that. Probably the ministry can be sued, but we've seen a history of tardiness on the part of matters getting to the court, or very selective behavior on the part of those who are ensuring that matters get to the court. So I don't see a solution coming through the judiciary. But I think public pressure by citizens, by the opposition, by the media, should force reimbursement, full reimbursement to the treasury, and sanctioning of those responsible.
Okay. I was going to make another statement, but in the interest of time, I'll hold it back. Alvin, any final thoughts? Dave, your final thoughts is already 8 o'clock.
Well, I mean, I just want to thank Dave for his contribution this evening. I think he touched on several areas. I mean, this in itself is an elephant of itself, and you can't eat the whole elephant at once. You have to decide whether you take a leg or a part of leg thing. So, but I think he covered quite a bit of areas. But it is really important to note, though, and he mentioned that the separation of, one might say, separation of powers, the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. But I think the critical part there really, well, I wouldn't say critical, but one of the major part or component, the guardrails there, is that of the executive and the permanent secretaries. And that's why I keep saying on several occasions when I do have the opportunity that they must not be left on how should I say it, unchecked, because they have a very fundamental role to play. Mm-hmm. I mean, let me just say, for example, you have what is called the Public Accounts Committee. Mm-hmm. That's supposed to oversee how funds are expended, funds that were voted on by the legislature. And the minister doesn't appear before the Public Accounts Committee, you know. Is the permanent secretary, the accounting officer. This is the person that goes before the Public Accounts Committee, not the minister. So I think when all is said and done, I think programs like what we are doing there right now and having Dave on this program with Civic Vibes is to educate the people. So when the people understand how this thing works, because even like, you know, the explanation I gave with regards to the 3 pieces of memorandum, if you understand how these things work, you could understand clearly when wrong is done and a procedure has been violated. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to continue doing that program, educating it and repeating it. Repetition, repetition, repetition. So again, thank you, Dave. Thanks for all those folks who are still with us and clocked in. And they too were giving their comments. I'm sorry we're not able to get to all of your comments, but I've been, both Lofty and I've been reading it. And we normally go back and review it again. So we want to thank you for all of those who remain. And hopefully, Dave, you're going to have to come back because I suspect there's going to be a part 2. We got to do a part 2. And that part 2 would be what action do we take now moving forward?
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alvin. Dave, yes, very nice having you. Your final comments. We must go in just a bit.
The citizens must be aware that the public sector is managed by public law, and the conduct of the executive is something that they must be vigilant about. The decisions of the executive impact the quality of life and the financial burden that citizens have to carry. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Messing up Trinidad, politics is your game.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. David Edwards, here tonight as guest. Folks, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for your eyes and ears each and every time.
All right.
Let's take a little bit from Klepto from Trinidad, and then we're gonna wind it down here.
So bring me money back, whether from Miami or Panama. We want me money back. Your blood-sucking vampire. Bring me money back. Your garage pack up with Mercedes. We want me money back. Your fortune big go to her knees.
And says we want we money back.
That's to give you no rest. Won't retreat, won't surrender. Till they put you under arrest.
So folks, that is it for us. 5 minutes past the hour of 8 o'clock. See you guys next week, same time, same place.
Thank you, love.
Your helicopter big for a kid and a tennis pro. Like farmer from your milky cow. But now paying holier than thou. From every big contractor, your team and your cut. But now like a Hollywood actor, you're playing patriot. From school repairs to highway, your pocket is stuck. You more than Black Friday. Look, enough is enough. Man, bring me money back from your piggy bank and all. Please watch me money back. Whether from Falls or a Holland Mall. Bring me money back. All the Grey Goose that you lace. Please watch me money back. You and your partners.
So yes, folks, finally, we want to thank Mr. David Edwards here for guest tonight. Brother Alvin Thomas and the Civic Vibes team, we love you guys very, very much indeed. Whatever is left of your night, do enjoy, and a great and pleasant week ahead. Bye-bye. See you guys next week. We love you.
That's your rule. Many graduate from your teeth in school. So much that I done lost track. You refine the autograph and kick back. You got away scot-free, and only because police made a mockery of our white-collar laws. Where you get the money for all them mansions that you build. Oh, it isn't funny for branding pension shrinking still. So bring me money back. All the cash you stash overseas. Bring me money back. How we in a touch with the